Chainsaw history.
Yesterday we had some technical difficulty.
Yeah,
Hopefully today we won't have some weather difficulty.
Like, we seem to have forgotten how to do this, so now we're trying something completely different.
That implies that we ever really knew what we were doing.
No, we've never done this.
And that's a complete false narrative.
Yeah, we've never done this the same way twice, and so why start now?
Yeah, we're just
now we're outside
out.
sweating. The sun is shightly brining. The sun is brightly shining, and there's yet raindrops falling on the roof over our heads and our delicate electronic equipment.
Well, that's because there is blue skies all around us, except for there is a literal dark cloud right the fuck over our head.
Way too more of a metaphor than I was looking for. So yeah, we got an outdoor setup. I've got a paper script covered in handwritten notes. This is completely not the way we've ever done this before. And we got a giant sheet of plexiglass in between us.
Fun. But you know what? I'm on my porch.
There we go. Yeah,
I'm on my porch, so I'm in my bathing suit, and guess what? It's white girl summer.
Yep, the White Claw is out.
The claw is out.
We may or may not be slightly medicated.
I'm always slightly medicated, but I have to.
All right, so we haven't done this in forever now. It has been a huge long time since our last recording session. This is theoretically Chainsaw History, the podcast where we swear and make fun of historical figures.
Because they're terrible.
I'm Jamie Chambers. This is my sister Bambi.
Hello.
And we are theoretically, once again, a comedy history podcast. I'm not a historian, but I did take some history in college, and I am a nerd who says the F word a lot.
I'm a mom. But I'm funny. Enough. Supposedly. Also in theory.
Speaking of hilarious parents.
Ooh.
I'll just leave that.
I'm just going to leave it in the air.
I'm going to get myself in trouble if I keep talking anymore. So let's just jump straight into it. Our entire family is basically from Alabama. Specifically from the Fort Payne area, the former sock capital of the world. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise that a member of our family has a loose connection to the topic of today's episode.
I'm surprised all of our family doesn't have a loose tie to the topic of this.
This is the one that I found on accident. In fact, this was the thing I found out about that gave me the whole idea to do this podcast. The May 6th, 1972 edition of the Daily Mail in Hagerstown, Maryland, gave a bunch of front-page real estate to an article titled, "Wallace Campaign Does Booming Business," referring to a presidential election campaign. In the article, a close relative of ours, who we will not name, is identified as working at the Wallace headquarters almost every night for a month. This same relative is quoted as saying, "Wallace has been my man for 10 years. We're going to get him in this year." Now, I don't know how much you know about George Wallace, longtime governor of Alabama and one-time presidential hopeful, but going into this research, I only knew a few lines from one speech.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
And I just threw up in my mouth.
Yeah, it's that guy. And honestly, that's really all I knew about him before this. Somebody we're closely related to was all about him back in 1972. And supposedly had been with him all since 1962. So think about that timeline in your head as we go through his story.
Oh, I love Alabama. I'm so glad that I don't actually live there.
No, we moved to the racist state next door.
Yeah.
So, in other words, I just knew...
Everything's fine.
It's fine. And the good news is he's dead. George
Hooray.
Wallace is the dead racist former governor of Alabama. But the fact that someone in our family supported him so strongly but hasn't spoken about him our entire lives made me curious, and I fell down the research rabbit hole. And I expected to find a simple racist, and instead I found a way more complicated man that's probably even worse if you think about it. He's a piece of shit. Let's talk about him.
Yeah, it's like diving into a pool of shit.
Just hold your nose. You're going to find little moments of joy in the middle of this, despite the bad stuff, I promise.
Like he gets shot?
Spoilers. All right, first, let's acknowledge our main sources. The first is the biography, The Fighting Little Judge by Jeffrey K. Smith, and our second is a really excellent documentary that anybody who wants to check it out, they can find it on YouTube. It's called George Wallace, Setting the Woods on Fire, presented by The American Experience, which was on PBS. That came out, I think, like 21 years ago. It's a really nicely done documentary. It has a lot of direct interviews with people who knew and worked with Wallace. So let's get started. So George Corley Wallace was born in Barber County, Alabama, down in the southeast of the state, less than a 2 hours drive from Albany, Georgia. Only a year after the end of World War I, so we're talking 1919.
Okay, so right around the time we got the vote.
Yeah. Women, that is.
Women.
The little wooden house of his childhood didn't have electricity or running water. The nearby town of Clio didn't have paved streets. He was the oldest child of 4, which is important to note because his siblings later become key players in the Wallace, Alabama political machine. George's father was an angry little man who was constantly drinking Coca-Colas and chain smoking, which sounds a little bit like my ex-wife.
Is this when Coca-Cola still had cocaine in it?
We're in 1919. I gotta assume so. I don't know.
It's before Prohibition.
But this isn't that very early 20th century thing. So at least maybe right there.
A little bit.
I don't remember that detail from the last time I went to the Coca-Cola Museum. Yeah, George's father apparently got so pissed off one time he stabbed a friend during an argument, which, at least
Which totally indicates they put the cocaine back in.
My ex, who's also for a long time, chain smoking, constantly Coca-Cola drinking person with a temper from Alabama, but did not stab anybody. As far as I know, she liked to throw things. Now, both Wallace parents had a temper that they passed on to their oldest son, and they didn't spare the rod, if you know what I mean. George Sr. was known to take a leather razor strap to his children's backsides, while the missus preferred the switch. And I don't think you're from an Alabama family if you haven't had to cut the switch you'll be beaten with at least a couple of times, in your childhood.
Yeah, no, we never got a switch.
I got a switch.
You got switched? I
Back in the
very
knees.
distinctly remember being threatened with switches, but never actually gotten beaten with one. But I did get to hear all of the stories from our cousins. So
getting switched sucks. I mean, it's a very common Southern, old-fashioned...
That is an Alabama thing. You're in trouble when you have to pick your own switch.
And then, and then you think by picking a little thin one, that's going to be okay, and then instead you're just giving yourself those tiny little paper cut size... Yeah, it sucks.
We call that abuse now.
One of the Wallace brothers, Gerald, put his mother's parenting style in plain words. She whipped the living shit out of us.
I've heard that quote before.
Yeah. As a young child, George would accompany his grandfather, who was a doctor, on house calls out in the country. This opened him up to not just his own poor upbringing, but gave him a wide view of the kind of suffering poverty inflicts. And for all his many, many faults that we will talk about at length, George Wallace would always consider the needs of the poorest citizens in Alabama when it came to policy. Now, Dr. Grandpa Wallace pushed George to become a pastor, something that he was completely uninterested in, but he very much used the style of a revival preacher in his future political ambitions, which started when he was 8 years old and was elected president of his 3rd grade class.
So really, he didn't really give a shit about people. Not enough to actually, help them.
Yeah, a pastor is somebody who, at least in theory, is out to help his community and his congregation, whereas
a politician doesn't even claim to give any fucks.
And he locked that in. At 8 years old, he ran for president of his 3rd grade class and won.
Gross.
Yeah, he was that kid.
Ew.
And you're going to hear even more. George got a taste of large-scale political machines at age 13, helping his father campaign for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who you might have heard of.
I love FDR.
Yes, little air horns for FDR. The Wallace family went all in on the FDR and the New Deal, and the populist messaging definitely made a strong impression on the teenage boy. Now, Bambi, I hate to break normal standard rules that we all agreed to in the 1990s, but to maintain my integrity as an amateur podcast comedy historian, we have to talk about Fight Club.
But the first rule
of
Fight Club.
But the history has to be told.
The history of Fight Club has to be.
So yes. So as a young teenager, so this is still when he's 13, 14 years old, George and his brothers built a crude boxing ring in their backyard, just using materials they found lying around. So, like, just planks and rope.
Fuck me, now see young George Wallace is played by a young Edward Norton in my head. Which I have no problem seeing Edward Norton as a white supremacist because I've seen that movie before.
I think that we've... Yeah.
That's a great movie, by the way. It's
even
rough. It's harsh.
Yeah. So they charge 1 cent admission for other kids to watch the Wallace boys beat the living shit out of each other. Sometimes drawing dozens standing around or sitting on tree stumps. At ages 17 and 18, while also serving as quarterback of his high school football team, George Wallace twice won the Alabama Golden Gloves Bantamweight Boxing Championship.
Okay.
So a bantamweight is for boxers between 115 and 118 pounds. Okay. So, and he was 5'7". So he was like a little-ish guy.
Dude.
But he was willing to throw down. And he was in great shape in his younger life. He was very athletic and had an attitude. And in fact, I think that whole persona as a fighter really informed the rest of his life. Like, lots of people avoid confrontation, especially physical kinds, and Wallace was the kind of guy who, like, is all about arguments and totally ready to throw down. He leaned into his image of, like, the scrappy little guy ready to go to war over just about everything.
That tracks. From what little I know, that tracks. So this guy was a dick from the beginning. Who really, he didn't want to join the church because he wanted to punch people in the face.
Well, he always went to church because that's what you did when you lived in Podunk County, Alabama in the early 1900s. But he just didn't want to be a pastor. That was not the life he saw for himself. Now, once he was 15 years old, George took an opportunity and scored a spot as a page for the Alabama State Senate. Only 4 such positions were available. So he campaigned by writing letters to each of the senators and tried to meet as many of them as he could wearing the only suit that he owned. So, 15 years old, fresh-faced little George worked his little heart out to get this little spot, and it got him a boarding home and a salary of $2 entire per day. As a page... Yeah, $2.
$2 whole dollars.
Now, as a page, George was exposed to the full political machinery of Alabama state government. So he's meeting and working for some of the most important men in the legislature. He ran errands and learned typing and shorthand and drove the lawmakers around. And it's really easy to imagine his whole future ambitions were born as a scrawny, pimply teenager in Montgomery. So now we get to 1937 when George began college in the fall, forced to hitchhike to get to Tuscaloosa to attend the University of Alabama. Being the broke kid he was, he had to hustle waiting tables in order to afford the tuition of $120 per semester. So he's working his way through school.
He's working his way. How much did you say?
$120 to go to the biggest university in the state.
In Alabama, Okie dokie.
Now, on one hand, that's not a lot, but this is also 1937.
It's 1937,
The Great Depression
honey.
is kind of in full swing at this point, and he's from a poor family in a poor town.
And yet he could still do that.
Yeah, he got in.
And he still managed to get in and work his way through college and support himself.
His grades and the power of being white helped.
Yeah. College makes me sad now.
So, but safe to say, though, he at least wasn't one of these rich kids who coasted through. He had to bust his ass to make his way through college, to be fair. He majored in pre-law back then with just a 2-year undergrad degree. George was a mediocre student and never accomplished anything in campus politics because his poor status and background kept him out of the fraternities that rule the on-campus political machine at the University of Alabama to this very day.
Oh, you mean he didn't like the elitism that was involved with the campus system? Wow.
It bothered him.
It really bothered him. I'm sure he's going to do something to right some of these, cultural wrongs.
When he was when he was asked about his frat, George identified as a GDI, a goddamn independent.
I feel that, actually. I'm a goddamn independent.
A few noteworthy things from his time at college. George served as captain of the university boxing team and showed continual excellence in the ring. And in fact, there's actually a pretty cool picture you can find of one of his college boxing days of him just really laying one into his opponent and blood flying out of the other guy's mouth. It's like a cool boxing sports photo. I mean, Wallace knew how to throw and take a punch. He worked as a ticket taker for football games and got acquainted with folks who would go. These are the important people in the area. So he met up and coming important people while he's sitting there selling tickets.
Because even in 1919, football was a big ass deal in college sports.
Oh, yeah. So he just kept ingratiating himself with people who would matter later. And it was during this time that George became friends with a student named Frank Johnson. He's a hardworking young law student with serious ambitions, and he'll become important later on, but just sort of put a pin in Frank Johnson for a second.
I'm sure it's going to be lovely.
At the moment,
this
they're
so
just
far,
buddies.
this entire story is like a Brillo pad against my soul. It's
Yeah,
just
but
a
here's the
cheese
thing: it's
grater.
like right now, there's nothing that says this guy couldn't go on to be a perfectly fine human being.
But I know better.
He's working. He's a poor working class guy who's busting his ass, working his way through his college. He's beating the shit out of people in the ring.
And,
I mean, I'm on board. So far, I'm on board. Up to this point, I'm on board with Wallace.
Instead of using that power for some kind of good, he decided to use it for evil.
So he met this guy, Frank Johnson, who he's buddies with back in college. He'll pop back up later. This is also the time in which George's father, George Sr., died of typhus. And typhus sucks.
Typhus sucks. That guy sucks.
Yeah, the angry little
Fuck that
chain-smoking
guy.
dude who beat them with a razor strap. He died.
And again, maybe if you don't beat your kids, they might not grow up to be fucking complete assholes.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So if you think he had it coming, typhus is rash, fever, nausea, vomiting, cough, severe joint pain, delirium.
No
and
one's
eventual
sad.
death.
He's dead. Move along.
He's dead. Fuck that guy.
Fuck that guy.
Worried about his family, George offered to drop out of school and work to help make ends meet, but his mother insisted he complete his education. And I cannot stress to you how difficult it was for George to work his way through school, because he had no family to lean back on. He had nothing.
So, if his mom would have just been like, yes, come home, support us, he would have just died in obscurity.
Maybe.
In Alabama.
But when you hear about everybody else and everything else that's going on, would he have been better or worse? So this is the questions to ask yourself as you keep listening, because it's not like he's the only racist in Alabama in the late 1930s.
Oh, I mean, there would have been a dozen other George Wallaces. It didn't.
And you're gonna meet.
I'm
You're
sure.
gonna meet some. So.
I'm sure I know some.
But for now.
I'm sure I know some intimately.
But for now, like I said, I'm trying divorcing my brain from the future. Young, still like 19, 20-year-old George Wallace. I'm kind of on board with him. Like I said, he's scrappy. He's got an attitude.
So far, so good.
And he's working his way through school. He used breaks from school as opportunities to earn tuition money for the next year, including a trip through Kentucky, Virginia, and the Carolinas. He was selling magazine subscriptions, and he got very good at it. And here's why. So let me give you a rundown of the George Wallace sales experience. So he's like sleeping in his car on the side of the road at night, and then he would walk up to an old farmhouse and begin a tirade of bullshit. Quote, "Folks, the federal government has passed a new law that says you got to have reading material. We're here to see what you'd like to pick out." And if the would-be customer pointed out the family Bible, George would counter with, "Well, that ain't any good. This new law says you got to have periodicals."
Ew. So he was a lying grifter to start with.
Oh, yeah. And if the family didn't have any money to spend, George didn't give up. "Well, let's see now. Maybe we can work something else out. Reckon you got some chickens or something."
Oh, ew.
So George usually left home with cash or something he could sell. And meanwhile, some like half illiterate housewife
is forced to have a magazine
like
that she
Good
didn't need
Housekeeping
and
or
couldn't
something.
afford because George Wallace is an absolute piece of dog
and
shit.
he's like either trying to sell a chicken or just cooking it on the
I'm
side
having
of
a
the
hard
road.
time even being funny
Which-
just because I'm so appalled by this story.
On one hand, it's bad, but at the same time, as a former broke college student myself, it's like I still kind of like him. He's just bullshitting people to sell
I
magazines.
hate that so much. As someone who actually had a job selling magazines in college, I can tell you I did not keep that job very long because I hate selling things that people don't need.
Yeah, it's other than like Fight Club and selling tickets. That's his first like big jobs he's using to help get himself through it. And then later on, Alabama passed a law requiring rabies vaccinations for all dogs. So George spent the summer giving dogs shots.
No, rabies is bad.
Yeah, we
Louis
don't like
Pasteur.
rabies.
Woo woo. Not a bastard.
As being constantly broke and hustling is the running theme of George's early life. So one of his other nicknames he acquired in early political campaigns was the Dog Doctor, just because he gave dogs rabies vaccinations. But still, that's a good thing to do.
It's a good thing to do. Dogs.
It's better than lying to poor farm housewives. about laws that don't exist.
I just hate him so much. I hope he got rabies. I hope a dog bit him and he got rabies. But I know he didn't. Just
At last, George graduated with his law degree in 1942. However, he was forced to drive a dump truck all summer in order to pay his overdue student fees so he could actually get his hands on his diploma. So he's still working his way through school after graduation. And it was during this summer that George fell madly in love. 22 years old, he fell in love with a pretty 16-year-old dime store clerk named Lurleen Burns.
Lurleen. That is an Alabama name.
Lurleen is Alabama, and she's about as Alabama as you get. I find Lurleen to be a fascinating character in George's story, and I wish I'd had more time to learn and had more to talk about, even though this is already pretty meaty script. But
you want to talk about Lurleen?
With Lurleen, there's more than meets the eye. She was a bit of a shy tomboy, but there were early hints that Lurleen was an extraordinary person. And spoiler alert, Lurleen is the future governor of Alabama. Sort of. We'll get there in the second episode.
One day. We'll get to you, Lurleen.
We'll get to Lurleen's big moment, but that'll be next episode.
I have a feeling I'm just going to start getting more Alabama as this continues.
It's going to happen.
Because I only have two really modes. I have my Bambi voice, which is fine, and this is what it usually sounds like. But if I want to go real Southern, I can go real Southern. My people are from Alabama.
I'm trying off a few slight variations of my...
You're trying so hard. It's like, I'm not going to be Alabama
I've got some Alabama people to quote, so I got an outlet.
You got an outlet for your
I'll be doing some of my Alabama as we go.
I do love the name Lurleen.
Lurleen.
That just... She sounds like she has, the fancy lady mullet.
But at this point, Lurleen is a 16-year-old girl who'd already graduated high school and was working her way through a local business school. So she's learning to type and learning shorthand and just how to be a good secretary. At 16 years old, George charmed her father and received the man's blessing, and then George and Lurleen started a serious courtship.
He asked her daddy's permission.
And once again, to be fair,
That is how things were done, because, again, women at this point were literal property.
Yeah. And, this is in the early 1940s, and a 22-year-old dating a 16-year-old wasn't quite as obscene then as it seems now. But I still don't think it's great.
How old? 16?
She's 16, he's 22.
It's gross, but it could be worse.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, especially for...
for the time, it's actually that's pretty normal.
That's about the same age difference as our grandparents on the Chambers side.
Yeah, that's actually... For the time period, it's actually a respectable age difference not completely gross.
And he did ask her family's permission before he starts dating their daughter, when she is still a literal child. So
they're like, you just go take Lurleen.
Yeah.
You just take her away. It's fine.
Did I mention it was 1942? Some stuff was going on.
Stuff was going on in 1942.
Yeah.
Like wars and shit?
George found himself as an aviation cadet in the Army Air Corps, which is the precursor to the modern Air Force, which didn't exist back then. Shortly after arriving to his first duty station, he contracted spinal meningitis and nearly died. The infection gave him minor paralysis and permanent nerve damage. Not the last time you'd hear those two words from a doctor.
With the exception of the getting married to a child bride, I'm glad something bad happened to him. Yay for spinal meningitis.
Now, he's not married yet. But this when he started.
He's just marrying...
He's dating this
Dating
chick.
a child. Although in 1940s, that means they're, holding hands and going to the soda shop.
It's hard to say, because Wallace was not the most... it's not like he's a sexually pure dude, as we'll find out later on. So, because of the damage from the meningitis, his hopes of serving as a pilot were forever dashed against the rocks.
So he couldn't go die in World War II?
Oh, no, he could still die in World War II, he just can't fly the plane.
Oh.
So, with George's political ambitions so thoroughly established, even his choices to serve in the army were motivated by his future determination to become the governor. So he decided to become an enlisted flight engineer, even though he qualified to attend officer candidate school. He later claimed, "I sense that if I got back to Alabama and into politics, there would be far more GIs among the electorate than officers." So he was literally thinking, everybody hates officers. There'll be way more enlisted dudes, and they'll vote for one of their own rather than an officer. So he chose his job and his role in the Army based on thinking about his political ideas for future. It's like, since he was a teenager, he told people back when he was a page at 15 years old in the state senate that one day he was going to return to Montgomery as governor.
And I'm gonna be governor. So gross.
After surviving the god-awful meningitis, George took advantage of a 30-day medical furlough to get back to Alabama and see Lurleen. He'd already almost died on base, and he was about to go fly on combat missions over Japan. So on May 22nd, 1943, the young couple headed to the Justice of the Peace with a handwritten waiver from Lurleen's mother for the teenage girl to get married. George paid the J of the P $1 entire for the privilege.
Well,
Their reception was a quick lunch before a bus ride to Montgomery, where Lurleen met her mother-in-law for the very first time. The couple spent their wedding night in a barely furnished boarding house with a naked light bulb dangling from the ceiling.
everyone has to have dreams.
Romance. Alabama romance.
Alabama romance. Go out into the woods and thug.
Let's get back to the war. Despite his lifelong battle with anxiety, George acquitted himself well on missions. But the whole time he was overseas, he dreamed of future power in Alabama politics. With free postage offered to everyone in the armed service, George sent dozens of Christmas cards to the people in his home county with the incredibly personal note, "Merry Christmas, your friend George Wallace." On base, George never shut the fuck up about his dreams and plans, declaring to everyone who would listen that he would one day be governor of Alabama.
It's just so gross. I can't even get past it. I can't get past how gross this story is.
He's very focused.
He is so focused. And again, the only one who's like, and he dreams of power. That's called a supervillain.
Yeah, red
They're
flag.
usually found in comic books.
When you're a little kid thinking, I need to be in charge of all this.
I need more power. Who thinks of that?
All these people should be listening to me right now. It's a super healthy thing for a kid to be thinking. And I have children older than he is at this point in the story, so I can still call him a kid. Even though he's technically a grown-ass man.
Technically by 1940 standards.
Yes.
Although if he's flying into war and being shot, I mean, that makes you a grown-ass man real fast.
Oh, yeah. And he did. He flew numerous combat missions, firebombing the ever-loving shit out of Tokyo. And finally, Wallace returned back to the United States just in time for the world's first nuclear weapons to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Fun, not war crimes at all.
Now, and the other thing, too, honestly, and this is one of those things I really learned in my college education setting, is like, one thing people don't seem to realize is that even though the dropping of the atomic bombs were absolutely war crimes, but they weren't any worse than what we were doing, like, in the firebombing raids on, like, Tokyo and some of these other cities. It's just that it used to take hundreds of planes and thousands of bombs to accomplish what one bomb could. It was just a matter of efficiency. That's another nightmare to talk about.
I'm going to open up another White Claw. I'm so very, very excited.
We're not sponsored by White Claw, but we will take their money.
Please. If there is anyone who should be my sponsor of life, it should probably be White Claws. Because this is about as basic as I go.
Yes, and off-brand White Claws, we're ready to take your money too. All right, so the war was over, but George clearly suffered from some form of PTSD and became a nervous wreck after the war was over, because he was still instructed to continue doing training flights.
It was not PTSD. This was World War II. You gotta call it shell shock.
Yeah.
Because where men were men and bombed children.
Well, George instead was so convinced that he survived the entire war and was going to be killed in some peacetime accident, he refused direct orders to go on these training flights.
Okay.
So
he wasn't scared of war, but he was scared of training?
Yes.
Alrighty then.
Again, shell shock or PTSD. I mean, he already had anxiety his whole life. This is something that defines him.
I feel that.
He's a major, like sort of, you can see maybe even like a manic depressive kind of personality. I mean, I can't obviously diagnose him with anything, but you can see these episodes where his anxiety takes over, where he gets depressed, but also where he has this like boundless energy at other times.
Is that why he starts like taking out things on black people?
No, he does that for much shittier reasons. You'll see.
For even shittier reasons?
No, you'll see. And like I said, this is why I think he's actually worse than a normal racist.
You're like, he's interesting and also more terrible.
And probably worse. So George said, as in reference to refusing direct orders, "Call it anxiety coming to the surface. Call it what you will. I decided I was through with flying."
Okay.
So, since he wouldn't follow direct orders, he was sent to the base hospital and diagnosed with a severe anxiety state. George would remain a nervous flyer for the rest of his life, and he received an honorable discharge on December 8th, 1945, including a 10% service-connected disability, and received $20 per month in veterans benefits.
Well,
it's better than the $2.
Yeah, I mean, it's better than the $2, and, you know.
However,
$20 worth of veterans benefits, and that's 1945.
This is 45.
1945 money. So that's not terrible.
It's just getting a couple $100 a month.
Yeah, I mean, like, it'll get you by, but not fabulous.
It's not great. Oh, and also in a combination from the meningitis and flying those really loud-ass bomber missions, his hearing continued to get worse throughout his entire life.
So he was an old deaf racist later. Yep. Fun.
Now, George wasted no time in getting the life he'd planned started. After a year-long stint as an assistant attorney general, George moved his family back to Barber County so he could begin his true lifelong career, politics. There he ran his first
lifelong career of being evilly in charge.
So, from The Fighting Little Judge by Jeffrey K. Smith, quote, "George C. essentially abandoned his wife and baby, spending every available hour visiting churches, schools, farms, mills, and town squares, pumping hands and making promises. Many county residents remembered Wallace from the Christmas cards he mailed to them during the height of World War II. When he could not borrow a car, Wallace would walk 5 to 6 miles at a clip, hitchhiking as he went along, determined to shake hands and make his name known to as many Barber County voters as possible. On Election Day, George C. won 56% of the vote, and he was on his way to the Alabama legislature and the beginning of a memorable political career."
Because nothing says networking like baby Jesus.
Yep. So, George won his first. He's now a member of the Alabama state legislature. Now, early on in his time in the state house, George made a powerful friend. In fact, literally the biggest man in Alabama politics. The governor, James E. Big Jim Folsom.
There are so many things in Alabama that have the name Big Jim on them, by the way.
I personally fell a little bit in love with Big Jim in the course of the story. And in fact, there's a documentary, I think that's free on Amazon I want to watch. Or maybe we'll do that for a bonus episode. I kind of like Big Jim.
You like Big Jim?
Yeah.
I know nothing about Big Jim except for like lots and lots and lots of things are named Big Jim in Alabama.
Well, Big Jim,
Jim's this, Big Jim's that.
Big
Jim,
he was not one of those ironically named little guys. Big Jim was 6'8", 275 pounds of loud, surprisingly liberal populism.
Woohoo!
Big Jim went after the big money in Alabama and fought for the interests of working class people. He had openly Jewish friends in the mid-1940s and made sure to personally shake the hands of African Americans in any crowd of supporters before the event even went on to make it clear where he stood, that they were welcome and that he was going to be fighting for them as well. So,
all right, so I can get behind Big Jim.
We're behind Big Jim 100%.
And again, Big Jim could be used as a giant human shield if necessary.
Yeah,
so there's
several people behind Big Jim.
You could truly get behind Big Jim.
And more importantly than just shaking hands, he tried to convince the Alabama legislature to abolish the poll tax, which kept poor people, mostly black, from voting.
Yeah, poll taxes are terrible.
Yeah.
And glad they don't exist.
And yeah, Big Jim was all against the poll taxes. Despite his efforts, Big Jim was ahead of his time and found too much resistance to his efforts to increase the ranks of registered black voters. Obviously, Wallace did not follow Big Jim's progressive lead on racial issues, but neither was he a violent racist. He was more of a polite, separate, but equal segregationist. And that's not great, but at the time for Alabama, that was kind of strictly middle of the road.
That was pretty all right
that's
for
like moderate.
Alabama.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where it's like, well, you know, a racist, the average racist in Alabama at the time would be like, well, you're not supposed to mistreat
He's like, I'll release dogs on you, but they won't be rabid dogs.
It's like, those people should be treated fair and well over there. They're just not allowed to, use my water fountain. That was kind of what they considered a moderate view in Alabama in the 1940s. It sucks, but it means that he didn't stand out. In fact, he was kind of like I said, a middle of the road. But these differences in opinion did not prevent George from following his mentor's populist lead. And because his proposals benefited poor people, most black residents of Alabama were included. So George introduced a bill for a 2% sales tax on liquor to fund post-secondary trade schools. This bill passed and led to the creation of 5 of the schools, 3 for the white students and 2 for their black counterparts.
Okay.
Wallace wrote legislation that provided free college tuition to widows and orphans of Alabamians killed during the war, also providing additional benefits to soldiers and their dependents who suffered disabilities.
Which are good things.
These are all good things. Over the coming decades, the law enabled more than 30,000 people to receive a secondary education. 10,000 of those people were black.
Okay. So, good things. Yay.
George even sat on the board of trustees for Alabama's best-known black college at the time, and it wasn't by accident. According to
I'm
Smith,
sure it wasn't, because everything's about politics.
You are correct. According to Smith's book, quote, "The ambitious young lawmaker was certain that the large African-American population of Alabama would one day win the right to vote. When that happened, Wallace wanted to be a recognizable figure to the expanded constituency." Unquote. So in other words, yes, it was all about politics.
All about politics. No, he was like, how can I get more power?
And while we look back on his racist remarks that sound a lot like the talking points of the modern right wing, his populist policy proposals made his colleagues think of him in the exact opposite terms. One political pundit declared at the time, quote, "He was a leading liberal in the legislature, no doubt about it. He was regarded as a dangerous left-winger. A lot of people even looked on him as an outright pinko."
Ew.
So literally,
Ew.
they considered Wallace.
They considered Wallace a liberal. That's how shit the world was.
Well, that's the thing. He was, except for the racial thing.
Except for he didn't like black people.
Like
He was
everything else,
totally
like
liberal.
except for the racial elements of his stuff, like all of his actual policies are the kinds of stuff we're talking about to this day. Higher wages for working people, good, union protections, and it's like
he just didn't like women or black people. He was fine with poor people as long as you weren't what.
And even
black.
then, again, you'll have to keep seeing it. At the moment, he's not even against.
He's not even against women or black people. He's just not for them.
He's not for them. He's just at the moment. He's just coasting on everything's fine, and I'm going to focus on helping these groups of people. So, and like I said, some of his colleagues thought he was practically a communist.
Oh, so gross.
So, but being a mere member of the legislature was not enough for George Wallace. So he decided to run for judge in Alabama's 3rd Judicial District, once again ignoring Lurleen and their now 3 children to go campaigning.
That tracks.
She was an unhappy wife, but she supported her husband anyway, and with a borrowed typewriter sent out countless letters to possible supporters in any case.
So she was a good politician's wife.
Yes.
As they all were.
In fact, maybe the most supportive politician's wife of all time. When we get all the way through part 2, you'll see what I mean. Regardless of her husband's behavior, Lurleen stayed loyal until the day she died. And another spoiler alert, Lurleen dies young.
Oh, poor Lurleen. So she was a neglected politician's wife
who was constantly cheated on.
Who was constantly cheated on, raised their babies, and then was expected to literally hold everything together, including the political careers, because guess what? That's what they all did.
And you have no idea yet what she's willing to do for this man. We'll get there.
Poor Lurleen.
Absolutely poor Lurleen. Out of everyone in this story, Lurleen is the one I feel the most sorry for.
I would call her a maligned woman, but that's redundant.
However, I think you'll also find, and like I said, this is all, we're jumping into what's going to be in part 2, but Lurleen also has kind of a shining moment. So she's a little bit of a feminist icon in her own weird way, maybe.
Woo-hoo. I like
Or not.
Or not.
Depending on how you look at it.
Depending on how you look. Well, you know what? It's like, any kind of feminist fuse in the 1940s is going to be...
So it's going to be, the question I guess can hang over before next episode will be like, if she does something that demonstrates female power, but she only does it in service of a man...
That's so gross.
How do you feel about it? And so that is something to ponder next time.
Well, just because I'm obsessed with Eleanor Roosevelt, she was not for suffrage. FDR was. Her husband was for suffrage, but she actually, for a very long time, kept the views that the woman belongs in the house, and she carried no opinion on voting because women, she didn't have time to think about that because she was raising her children. It wasn't until her kids were a little bit older and she got a little bit more breathing room and she realized that her husband was a lying, cheating piece of shit, as they all were. So, fun side story. Let's go back to Lurleen. Poor Lurleen.
Lurleen. So Lurleen helped George, and it was another successful campaign run by this up-and-coming political rock star. So now we got Judge George Wallace.
Rose.
Now, you might be surprised to learn about George's reputation in the courtroom as being both thorough and fair, unusually kind for the time to poor and black people.
Okay, well, that's good.
One African-American attorney praised the judge, quote, "Your Honor, I've practiced in many courts, but I have never been treated more fairly by a judge, by the jurors, by the officers of the court than I have here."
Okay, so that's like, he did one good thing.
Yeah.
I guess two if you talk, he was also a soldier in World War II, which was also a good thing.
Yeah.
Because, you know.
Now, anyway, we're back here. George is actually being courteous to black attorneys and defendants in his courtroom. Now, Judge Wallace supported segregation as the best way forward for race relations, but he had a zero-tolerance policy for racism inside his courtroom. He enforced respect from white attorneys to their black opposition and shared meals with black counsel who were not allowed in many local restaurants. So he would just eat lunch with the black attorneys since they weren't allowed places. So again, he's showing these people a lot more respect than other people. In fact, this one interview I saw of this black attorney who served under Judge Wallace's courtroom even said this was the first attorney who forced the white opposing attorneys to call them by name. And if they tried to call him boy or something, Judge Wallace like, no, you address him as Mr. So-and-so or whatever. He demanded, that level.
Some kind of courtesy and respect. Yeah. So there's that.
So the people who were in he had a reputation for being fair and very, like I said, moderate and genuinely kind to black people in his courtroom. Now, George continued to think about future politics, constantly keeping an eye out for news and any
You don't say he was keeping an eye out for politics?
Yes. And he used any spare time he had to ingratiate himself with potential future voters. He also saw a problem with his one-time mentor, Big Jim Folsom.
Big Jim.
Now, Big Jim's progressive views on race did not align with the majority of white voters in Alabama. And unfortunately, Big Jim did have a major character flaw, which was that he was a total drunk. Big Jim liked to drink.
Oh, that so tracks with 40s Alabama.
I know, right?
And, still, Prohibition state.
And like I said, Big Jim's one of the cool guys. He's cool with people from different backgrounds and races. And
he's cool, which is why he probably didn't like Prohibition, which is probably also why he's an alcoholic.
Yep. And unfortunately, the last straw for a lot of Alabamians came when a black New York congressman was invited to stay in the governor's mansion. It sparked so much controversy that George Wallace decided to take that moment to make a public break with Big Jim. In private, he said, "Well, Big Jim's always been weak on the N-word issue."
Go Big Jim.
And when the governor heard about this, Big Jim gave George the benefit of the doubt. "He ain't no race bigot. Me and George is close. George ain't nothing but a populist himself." Now, I think Big Jim was right, but also right in the fact that George would shift whatever way the wind blew. He was totally willing to court future black voters, but also willing to capitalize on white racism to win elections.
Because he was a politician, not an idealist.
Yeah. And he figured this is something that gets worse before it gets better. George began prepping for his first race for governor a full 2 years before it was actually time to run, assembling a powerful political team that stayed with him for decades, and formally announced his run for governor in January of 1958. Since Republicans were rare and completely doomed in Alabama in the 1950s, it was all about scoring the Democratic Party nomination. So if any Republican likes to say, we're the party of Lincoln, yeah, that's also why a Republican couldn't get elected back then, because the Democrats were the racist party of the time, and why Big Jim there kind of stuck out as a Democrat who actually...
Yeah, well, history says that Republicans were one way until they decided that it couldn't get them votes, so they turned a different way.
Took President Johnson to change everything around, and he comes up later in the story.
Fun.
But we're not there yet. We're still
Another dick?
We're still late in
Another
the late
dick
1950s.
named Johnson. It's like if we keep talking about all these dicks, we're just gonna. I mean, it's after this episode.
We could do a whole episode on Johnson's
We should
dick.
not do any more guys named George for a while. It's like that's
George
this is what we talk about in chainsaw history. Well, we're gonna talk to you about a historical figure named George.
Bunch of guys named George.
Buckle up. We got a whole shitload of them.
So, getting back to it, all he's really worried about is scoring the Democratic Party nomination. Once you got that on lockdown, you've got the state. Now, the details of the election are interesting. We don't have enough time to really get into it, but the main thing to know is that George's primary opponent was a guy named John Patterson. He was the Attorney General of Alabama running for governor. He was also the son of an attorney general who'd been assassinated while combating organized crime in Phoenix City, Alabama.
Fun.
There was a literal movie made about this father and son tale.
We got some Alabama gangsters.
So we got an older Alabama attorney general who went after organized crime, got killed, and now his son's gonna
He's gonna rise up like the phoenix and defend racist democracy.
Patterson was seen as a law and order hero to most people, and also as a strict segregationist to the delight of all the racists.
Of course he was.
As Attorney General, Patterson had obtained a court order banning the NAACP from organizing within the state, calling it an insurrectionist movement. Tell me if that doesn't sound familiar.
Oh yeah, this all tracks just well. I mean, we're still so yeah, cool.
You take a black civil
So
rights
we're still
organization.
doing this.
Yeah, you take a black civil rights organization and you accuse them of being terrorists or insurrectionists, and meanwhile ignoring the white people who literally invaded the Capitol. That's how we do things.
That's how we do things here. It's fine. Everything's fine.
So-
Look over here. Panic.
Exactly. Now, of course, Patterson threw out plenty of racist dog whistles while attacking Wallace, saying he went too easy on black defendants in court and that his fair treatment policies went against the principles of segregated life in Alabama. And remember, George wasn't some racial progressive. He was just a moderate. He showed people like the bare minimum of respect, which didn't jive with the culture of his home state.
No, because he was supposed to be sicking rabid dogs on these people, not giving the dogs shots and giving black people a different kind of shot.
Yep. For at the moment, George is not for sicking dogs on people, but don't worry,
We'll get there. We'll get there.
That's coming up
But
later.
they're not rabid because he gave them rabies shots.
Exactly. He took care of that shit. George bitched and moaned as he got trounced in this election.
Aww.
His complaining shows off his sociopathic, selfish outlook.
So what you're telling me is George Wallace, who is historically one of the shittiest people in all of Alabama, is actually, it could have been worse.
This guy, I mean, Patterson
Because this
sucked.
guy was worse. It's like if he would have just been governor and been like, hey, we could all be a little less racist.
If George had gotten elected in this election,
He probably would have been like, we could be a little more moderate. We could be a little less racist. But no, Alabama was like, we are digging into this motherfucker.
exactly. So in this case, the problem isn't George. The problem is the population of Alabama.
The problem is Alabama.
Or at least the ones who are allowed to vote right now.
Well, I'm going to go with, it hasn't changed a whole lottie lot.
So here's a quote about George bitching about having to run against Patterson at this time. I'm running against a man whose father was assassinated. How am I supposed to follow and act like that? So it's like, he literally
Spoiler!
like, man, I wish my father had been gunned down by the mob instead of dying of typhus.
That asshole.
He just
He just died. He didn't
Stabbed
even die for a cause.
drank a bunch of Coca-Cola and shit himself to death.
of
Oh well. It's also probably worth noting that Patterson enjoyed the full public support from the Ku Klux Klan, while Wallace actually condemned them. So Wallace is anti-Klan at this point, and Patterson...
So at this point where he's all right. Let's keep going.
Patterson didn't publicly talk about how great his KKK endorsement was, but he did say this, and tell me if this line sounds at least a little bit familiar. They, the KKK, include many fine, peace-loving individuals who merely want to preserve the white Southern way of life.
Ew.
Many fine people on both sides.
Many fine people on both sides.
God, nothing is ever... Like I said, the one lesson of history...
We're going to have to take 5 so I can go throw up in that bucket.
We don't learn shit.
We don't know. Well, if history has taught us anything, it's that we do not learn from history.
Goddamn thing. In stark contrast, Wallace gained the endorsement of the NAACP. So that's something you probably didn't expect.
That's a regret that the NAACP has probably carried with them for quite some time.
That might as well have been the nail in his coffin, though. George lost the election by tens of thousands of votes.
They were like, fuck black people.
And Patterson made the reason for his election victory quite clear. Primary reason I beat him was he was considered soft on the race question.
Ew!
Yeah, no, Patterson sucked.
Patterson sucks. I wish somebody would shoot him, too.
George conceded gracefully in public and took personal responsibility for the loss to his campaign staff. And he took one big lesson away from the race, agreeing with Patterson. Now, I'm not going to say it, so here's a clip. So this includes a quote, a word that I would normally censor out, but I think it's important to hear the way this man talked and thought and how it truly informs our understanding of just how cynical American politics truly is. So listeners can skip ahead past this short quote if they don't want to hear the N-word.
George Wallace came back to the district after the defeat, back to our county, and he asked me would I come over to his office and talk with him. So I did, and he said, "Seymour, you know why I lost that governor's race?" I said, "I'm not sure, Judge. What do you think?" He said, "Seymour, I was out-niggered by John Patterson, and I'll tell you here and now, I will never be out-niggered again."
This is...
Ew! It tracks, but it's gross.
Like, this is the moment of his, like, evil villain origin story where he's like...
And this is when he was like, I turned into grog.
I wasn't racist enough.
I wasn't racist enough for Alabama.
So this, like, just makes him decide, this is my guiding star now, at least for a while. Has nothing to do with how he really feels. It's just about... He got his ass kicked, and he decided this is the lesson.
Because, again, he doesn't actually have any idealism. He's just about himself and power.
No, not to... So let's bring up the musical...
Is that worse? I don't know if that's better or worse.
Let's bring up the musical Hamilton again.
Ooh, I love the musical
Remember how Hamilton was forced to whether he was going to endorse Jefferson or Aaron Burr, and finally he was like, I disagreed with Jefferson over everything.
Everything but
I endorse him anyway because he stands for something. And Aaron Burr doesn't believe in anything. I think Wallace was the Aaron Burr kind of guy, where it wasn't about him being horribly racist. It was about him being so ambitious and so amoral that he didn't give a shit who he hurt. He was willing to help black people when he thought that was the way to go, but he's just as willing to hurt them if that gets him the power he wants.
Which, again...
is worse to me.
That's worse!
To me, it's so much worse.
Is it better or is it worse?
Not that racists are great, but at
I'm
least
gonna go
you know
with
where they
worse.
stand. Anyway, we were talking about how essentially Wallace didn't believe in anything, and now he's decided to double down on racism.
Because, yeah, what else do you do? Because apparently black people, he figured out they weren't allowed to vote.
Yeah, and he'd already planted the seeds, like, just in case. He'd already done some things.
You know what? He could have changed laws.
He could have been like...
secured the right for the black vote, and he would have won.
Yeah. It's just he didn't care.
He didn't care.
He wanted to take the path of least resistance. He didn't want to make change. He just wanted power. He was nakedly ambitious. And with that in mind, this will come as a huge shock to you, but after getting his ass kicked in the Alabama gubernatorial race, he immediately began planning his political comeback. He looked around for an issue to make headlines with. And again, this isn't going to sound familiar at all.
Ew.
So at this time, we're talking 1958, the United States Civil Rights Commission saw some really shady shit going down in Alabama and suspected the state of massive voter disenfranchisement.
You don't say.
Voter disenfranchisement in 1958 Alabama, say it ain't so.
There's no Jim Crow laws here.
So the feds wanted to inspect the voting records. Wallace, as a state judge now in a lame duck session, refused to hand over the records in Barber and Bullock counties, citing, what else? States' rights.
That's not how states' rights work.
Always the follow-up question, states' rights to do what?
To do what? That's not a thing.
So, earlier you might remember that George was buddies back in college with a law student named Frank Johnson. We put a pin in Frank. This is where
now we're back to Frank.
This is where Frank strolls back into this story, this time as a newly appointed federal judge. and who was not amused at all by George's bullshit.
Good. Get him, Frank.
Threatening to toss Wallace's ass in jail for contempt for not turning over the voting records.
Yeah, because you got to do that. There are laws.
So George drove out to Montgomery in an attempt to charm his old friend, suggesting Johnson give George the citation, but only some little minor penalty. That way George could gain the political W he needed, but the feds would still get the records and everybody is happy. But it didn't go the way he wanted.
Good.
After the meeting, George...
Get him, Frank. Get him.
After the meeting, George reported, he told me I'd be wasting my time running for governor 4 years from now because I'd still be in prison. So Frank's awesome. We like Frank.
Yay. We like Frank. We like Big Jim. Everyone else, not so much so far. Maybe Lurleen.
Wallace did what would become his defining political move. He lost, but loudly claimed victory anyway.
Oh, you don't say.
So on a technicality, what he did was he turned over the voting records to grand juries that worked under him and had them turn it over, so he could still go on TV and still state truthfully that he didn't hand it over. He fought the federal government.
He fought them.
So he denounced the forceful intervention of the federal government into the sovereign affairs of the state of Alabama. Now, Frank Johnson continued to be a thorn in Wallace's side, or vice versa, depending on how you look at it. And George no longer carried any warm and fuzzy feelings about his old college buddy. He's a no-good, goddamn lying son of a bitchin' race-mixing bastard.
Ooh, he's a race mixer.
I know, right? Ew. Wallace finished up his judicial term and moved to Montgomery to join his brother's law practice and plan his next big political campaign.
Hooray.
Lurleen stayed with him despite their many marital problems, mostly because George was constantly gone and almost as constantly cheating.
How many kids does she have at this point?
I believe we're at 4.
4. Yep, because she's a human Pez dispenser.
And
Lurleen is nothing for, she's not good for anything.
And at the time, her only jobs are housewife
and babies.
And assistant to his campaigns, because he's constantly...
because he needs a secretary. Yeah, that's why she took all those classes.
Exactly. Continued to work as a consistent...
She was a useful human Pez dispenser.
She's incredibly... loyal wife.
If you look at any of these successful politicians, not good goddamn one of them could have done anything without their wives. I mean, there was the grassroots, all of that shit underneath it was done by their wives, whether they wanted to or not, whether they believed in them or not, or even whether they liked them or not.
And honestly, and as you'll see as we get into part 2,
there's nothing.
I don't know that there's any stronger version of that story than this one. Ew. When we get there, like Lurleen goes as hardcore into supporting her political...
Oh, Lurleen, you should have just stayed home having your babies. Okay.
So, mostly
you should have used your uterus powers for good instead of evil.
Leaving Lurleen behind, he traveled all over the state giving speeches in the poorest sections of Alabama, appealing to the working class by talking shit about the wealthy, which, that part I'm totally cool with.
Fuck the wealthy.
So, unfortunately, this is being a podcast about George Wallace. We can't really give the attention or coverage that the civil rights movement of this era deserves. So, let's just say that a bunch of important events happened in Alabama during this period where George is preparing his next political campaign. Civil rights protests erupt into violence more than once, with local cops in full cooperation with violent racist mobs.
There is a reason why the civil rights movement picked Alabama.
Yeah. So, like, for example, May 14th, 1961, there was a group called the Freedom Riders. These were like an integrated bus ride from in this case, they were going to Anniston, Alabama. They stop and they were immediately assaulted by a white angry mob, and the cops just stayed behind and had like a timer and waited like 10-15 minutes before they'd rush in and actually help the protesters. And the protesters got the shit kicked out of them. The same thing happened only days later in Birmingham. So like
violence is erupting.
Violence is already starting. It's not hardcore violence yet, it's just small skirmishes, but it's just like the appetizer for what's going to be happening later in the 60s.
It's a pot. It's just boiling. It doesn't...
Pressure cooker at this point. So Wallace looked at the state of affairs and correctly realized that long-term segregation was doomed. But he also knew that white panic was now kind of at an all-time high, and it could propel him straight into the governor's mansion.
Oh, white panic. My favorite subject.
So he leaned into the racism.
Of course he did.
As soon as 1962 began, so did George Wallace. Since at the time, Alabama did not allow a governor to serve any consecutive terms, George did not have to face Patterson a second time. Instead, his main opponent was his one-time former mentor, Big Jim Folsom.
Go Big Jim! He's gonna defeat Big Jim, and it's gonna make me sad.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And at first, things were not going well for George. George always suffered with anxiety and depression, like we've already said, but this time it got so bad, his campaign staff had to secretly hospitalize him. Like, literally put him in a disguise and snuck him into the hospital because he was so fucked up. And nobody was sure. They were thinking that the campaign might have to be canceled because he was just a fucking wreck, and he wasn't looking like he was going to get out of bed anytime soon. But one day an aide came in and dumped a sack of campaign contributions onto the hospital bed.
He should have put a pillow over his face.
No, instead he put $20,000 of cash in his lap.
Oh, so he got a cash infusion while in the hospital.
$20,000 in 1962 money on his hospital bed.
Okay.
George perked right back up and was
sure.
making televised speeches the very next day.
Yeah,
it's amazing what 20 grand will do.
Miraculously cured. You know, if anyone wants to volunteer it, $20,000 would also cure my depression. Anyone who wants to volunteer that.
The Wallace campaign was all about states' rights and segregation, which ultimately meant the same thing in 1962 Alabama. Wallace attacked the federal government and liberal judges, such as his ex-friend Frank Johnson, who he kindly called integrating, carpet-bagging, scallywagging, race-mixing, bald-faced liar.
Oh.
He loved to go on these, tirades.
Big, long tirades of calling people wrong names like carpetbagger.
And
One of
scallywag, another one.
Scallywag. That is very Southern.
That's very Southern. It has a very specific Southern meaning.
Carpetbagger is very specifically Southern.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's like we didn't hear carpetbagger growing up because we're not that old.
I heard
a little bit.
I'd hear carpetbagger every once in a while,
little bit,
especially
but mostly it was just damn Yankee.
Damn Yankees. George showed off his kids and loyal wife on the trail while constantly screwing campaign aides behind Lurlene's back. He got polite applause for talking about building highways and schools, but received standing ovations when speaking out against racial integration. And with racism clearly being the winning strategy, his campaign quietly hired a speechwriter named Asa Carter. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Asa Carter. He's a guy who could get his own episode. He's a fascinating guy. At the moment, he is a powerful leader with his own segment of the Alabama KKK.
Oh, yay.
For example, he wrote this speech in which we started this episode with the segregation now, segregation forever thing.
He wrote that racist ass.
But interestingly enough, later on in his career, Ace Carter starts writing under the name Forrest Carter, and again, Forrest naming after Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK, but he wrote under Forrest Carter and wrote a couple of very successful novels. So writing under the name Forrest Carter, Ace Carter wrote The Rebel Outlaw Josie Wales, later made into a movie by Clint Eastwood, also wrote The Education of Little Tree.
Okay, I have at least heard of both these movies. I've probably seen both of them, but...
He wrote the book versions.
As young.
And under Forrest Carter, he also claimed to be, part Cherokee Indian, which was a total lie.
Which is total bullshit.
He was a white supremacist. He was literally the leader of a KKK chapter. And he became kind of like the head speechwriter for George Wallace at this time without anybody knowing about it. So in 1962, Alabama radios played a political jingle. I don't know what it sounds like, but the words were, "Vote right, vote white, vote for the fighting judge."
I'm gonna just die over here for a minute.
And remember,
everything sucks.
That our relative who was claimed to be a supporter during this time as a young person.
I understand.
Said that they didn't know George Wallace was racist.
Which is a lie.
Vote right, vote white.
Yeah,
God is angry at this political jingle.
See, again, even God, it was just like, you know what? This is a terrible story.
Which is why we better try to get through these last couple pages before it pours down rain. Sadly, Big Jim could not get past his alcoholism for the campaign and was so obviously and embarrassingly drunk on the day of the Alabama primary, which, remember, was the only election that mattered at the time, he couldn't tell two of his daughters apart.
Oh,
Like
poor
on
Big
stage
Jim.
in front of everybody.
But
He's like, which one are you again?
what? That's
That's not great.
That's not great. I mean, from someone who has seen their father drunk more than once, he always knew who I was. I had
Now-
a good daddy, though. Rest in peace.
Rumors flew around that the Wallace campaign spiked Jim's punch.
Ew.
We don't know if that's true, but if it is, it's so awful.
That's...
Like a known alcoholic, and they just went for it. But that we don't know if that happened. That's just the rumor.
Well, you know what? Fucking...
But it sounds like the kind of dirty trick.
It sounds like the kind of dirty shit, it's
when
like...
when you're willing to secretly have your head speechwriter be the head of the KKK, then yeah, you're willing to spike somebody's drink. That's not something... I don't know that it happened, but I 100% believe they would have done it if they could have done it.
Yeah. No, you know what? I'm gonna go all in for Big Jim. Fuck those guys.
Yeah, Big Jim...
They totally fucking sandbagged Big Jim.
Big Jim deserved better.
Big Jim did deserve better. Maybe he just couldn't see his daughters because, he got roofied and shit.
So, one way or another, Big Jim went down, and it came down to a runoff election between Wallace and a more polished intellectual candidate, who George just smashed and kicked his ass. And he rode racist populism as the correct formula straight into becoming the governor-elect.
Of course.
George Wallace spoke out against the Kennedy family, against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., against the federal government and liberals. He won the general election in a landslide. Now remember, the Republicans didn't even field a candidate against him, and yet he still won the largest popular vote victory in the history of the state of Alabama, despite him not even needing it to win.
I hate you, Alabama.
Yeah. On a cold January morning in 1963, George Wallace achieved the goal he'd first declared as a dirt poor kid in rural Alabama. He was sworn in as governor.
I achieved power! As his evil racist laugh.
This was one of his big great moments. He was sworn in as governor of Alabama. He noted he was standing only feet from where the oath of office was given to the President of the Confederate States of America. And he gave the speech that would define his life, once again written by that guy Ace Carter.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Well, I don't feel good about that.
Privately, however, George was quite clear that racism was not his guiding star, only ambition was. He didn't hate black people, but he was more than willing to pretend that he did in order to achieve power. He said, quoted a number of times by different friends and associates, "I started talking about schools and highways and prisons and taxes, but I couldn't make them listen. Then I began talking about the N-word, and they hollered and they stomped the floor."
That's so sad and gross.
So that's it for part one. We'll pick back up with George's career as governor, see what happens with Lurleen, see what happens when somebody tries to kill him, and
Go trying to kill him!
And sadly, this is when Big Jim Folsom, it's at the end of his thing. But I actually want to learn more about Big Jim. There's a documentary I want to check out, because he seems like my kind of guy, especially for his time. Like, he was way ahead of the curve.
I mean...
So how you feeling about good old George Corley Wallace at this point?
I don't feel good about him. I mean, so far you've not changed my opinion one iota. I am a firm believer that he was a dangerous piece of shit.
No, I started with the thesis statement that he's a piece of shit.
He's
just
dangerous.
Not necessarily
dangerous.
the kind of piece of shit you thought you were going to get when you first started.
No, he's worse.
Yeah, because he's not an actual dyed-in-the-wool racist.
No,
and in fact,
he's
you will
worse.
see in the future, he's willing to 100% do a 180 on this. He doesn't believe this shit at all.
He doesn't believe this shit at all, but he'll still burn a cross on your lawn.
If that's what it takes. For the
Fucking
power of George
asshole.
Wallace. And another thing you'll see going into this is that another thing he has kind of in common with Trump is that it seems pretty clear, like most politicians, they look at running a campaign as this thing you have to go through that sucks in order to get the office you want, the power in order to do the things you're trying to do. Whereas Wallace figures out he actually enjoys the campaigning. He wants the roar of the crowds and the applause. And he likes the chase. He doesn't actually care much about governing once he's actually there. He gets bored with it quite quickly.
Well, that's all just great.
So,
I'm so looking forward to more of this.
We have no idea, dear listener, when you're going to hear this, but whenever you do, please check out my Patreon, which is patreon.com/JamieChambers. You can see stuff related to this content and more at my website, jamiechambers.net, where you also find about things like upcoming Twitch streams. The Patreon will have bonus content. We've already done one bonus episode, and we've got more on the way. And the bonus episodes are where we're going to kind of let our hair down, and instead of me writing a big script, we'll mix it up and let Bambi lead the way, or we'll just have a loose discussion about something without having to do a whole lot of research.
I have a few ideas, so if you're interested in actually listening to me talk, or even possibly me read you a bedtime story.
Yeah, we got Bambi's bedtime stories coming up. I was thinking about doing some very short format videos where like a really short historical point ties into something going on in the world right now. Like, for example, I've been seeing yet again more hatred for Dr. Anthony Fauci and the rumors of the horribleness of the vaccine. And I'm reminded of that back when Dr. Richard Jenner, who's the creator of the smallpox vaccine, who may have saved more human lives than just about anybody, and yet in certain like European cities, they
burned him in effigy. Yeah.
It's just like crazy how, so it's like little things like that, showing how we don't learn anything from history. But when people don't want to listen to us talk for like 2 hours, I'll say it in like 1 minute. Now, I don't know, again, when you guys are going to hear this episode, we said we're going to be supporting some charitable donations for our listeners. I've got a new one, and especially since we're talking about Alabama and labor rights and poor people. Right now, you may not know, but there is a huge strike going on for the United Mine Workers of America in Alabama. They're going up against a really awful hedge fund that bought out their old mine company, and they need help to make it as long as it takes just to get fair wages. Like right now, they're being paid below the curb in one of the more dangerous, like deep mines in North America. So you can check the show notes, or if you can just search online for UMWA Strike Fund for information on how you can help. And you can either donate directly to their strike fund, or you can donate food to their food pantry, which gives groceries to keep their kids fed during the whole thing. And since that's in Alabama and kind of ties in, that seems appropriate enough for me.
And probably for the next few episodes, I'm gonna go with everyone, just kind of take care of you. Give yourselves and your loved ones a check-in. See if you guys are okay, because we did talk about anxiety, which hits home for me a lot. I suffer with generalized anxiety disorder, and sometimes have a really hard time with it. I suffer from minor depression, but nothing big. But this last year seems to have been a lot for everyone, and we have a whole world that is going completely crazy. There's mass shootings all the time. There's riots and burnings and hatred and just terrible things everywhere. So check on yourselves, check on your loved ones, and make sure that everyone in your circle is okay, because you can't do anything for anyone else if you're not taking care of yourself.
Yeah, I like that. Kind of like the analogy of the mask that dropped down in an airplane for an emergency. Like you got to take care of yourself before you're ready to assist somebody else. But if you are in that situation where you think you might need some help, please reach out to someone. I mean, and if actual medical help is available to you, don't be ashamed or afraid to go look for that. But even if you just need a trusted friend or a family member to talk to and tell what you're going through, don't feel like you have to go through anything alone.
And the one problem, don't push people away. Check on your loved ones. Check in with people. If you haven't heard from someone in a while, it might be a good idea to send them a message, send them a text, because everyone seems to be hurting right now, and in a lot more ways than most of us can even see or comprehend. So, take care of you this week, and I hope to see you next time. If you want to see me actually, you won't even see me on Instagram, but if you want to follow my pets, I'm at Bambi Chambers. And if you want to check out possibly some baking videos, you can shortly start looking for me on bakedbaking.net.
Neat. You will see a completely different side where she makes edibles.
I love edibles. I love them so much. But again, we recently got some legal weed here in the state of Georgia. So I am an excellent baker, and I've actually been dabbling in edibles over this last year because, again, depression, anxiety, and I have 3 herniated discs in my neck. So
Yes,
I had to learn how to make them, so I would like to teach you how to make them.
Edibles that are legal in your area are an excellent form of self-care.
Absolutely. Or you can just smoke that shit. But take care of you.
Until this next time, disrespect racists from Alabama or any state.
Boo! Fuck racism.
And go Big Jim.
Go Big Jim.
See ya.
Poor Lurleen.
Or Lurleen. See you next time.